Thanks for coming out on this cold evening. Welcome to the Eastside Freedom Library. I hope that everyone got a chance to sign in. So tonight we have a presentation by Paula Overby, who is an author, and the title of her book is The Transgender Myth Through the Gender Looking Glass. I believe there are copies that will be for sale after the event. The title of tonight's event is Both Sides of Feminism, and I think it's a really timely topic. We're having a lot of discussions now that are showing us a lot of the conversation that we need to have, and the way that we need to think about a lot of issues and sort of the cast that gender issues put on them, and we can't really afford to do that in overly simplified way. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation, and I hope that a lot of you have questions after the presentation. And I'm probably forgetting to say something else, but with that, I'm just going to hand it over to Paula, who I think has a good talk and slide presentation.
Thank you. And thank everyone for being here tonight on such a cold night. I actually did have a couple of cancellations because of the cold. That was nice of them to contact me and tell me they couldn't make it. But I'd like to start by saying that this is not a TED Talk. It's not intended to give you some kind of aha moment. So I encourage discussion, and I encourage anybody to ask questions during the presentation at any time. Just put your hand up. There's a lot of text in these slides. I probably won't read all of the text. A lot of the text in these slides is from the book, and it's there mainly for, I guess, sensibility in case so people can review the PowerPoint itself. For me to suggest that there's only two sides to feminism, I hope is suggesting an obvious fallacy. Feminism has many facets to it. Sometimes those are conflicting or contradictory. I personally have always felt that feminism is inherently a struggle among women over competing ideologies. Women have a basic choice that men don't have, and that's childbirth. And a lot of gender policy and history and social issues revolves around that. Go ahead, can you? Thank you. A little bit about me. That's the cover of the book. It's not a class about transgender, but it is observations about feminism from my perspective as a transgender woman. So I'll say a little about how I define transgender. My challenge as a trans woman has always been the necessity of looking at both sides. That's not always a popular position. When you take the opposite side, sometimes I have to consider all sides. Next one. Oh, back up. Just a little bit about me, I guess. I didn't read the title of the slide. I had a great childhood. I grew up in a small town in Grafton, Wisconsin. All my friends were girls. I was pretty much free to be a girl. I thought probably I was a girl. My parents moved me to another small town in New Hampshire when I was in junior high. It was a school that separated the boys from the girls. That's when my life started to get really complicated. I am a rape survivor. I was raped in college. I had very difficult relationships with men and very difficult relationships with women, but I did finally marry a woman because I wanted children and I wanted to be a mother. Raised 3, I think, pretty amazing kids. That ended in a really ugly divorce. not surprising considering the enormous problems that my wife and I had to deal with. After that, and that's pretty much when I transitioned. So that's a basic summary of a lot of the book. But the book is not really about my life. It's really more about how I viewed the world. And I learned about the world from trying to understand other people's perspectives, why they thought what they thought, why they did what they did, why they behaved the way they do. And looking at the world that way I've never had any kind of a problem with diversity because I'm always wondering what the other side is thinking, and I'm trying to figure that out. And I think all of us might be a little better off if we could visualize the world that way through the eyes of everyone else. It's the old walk a mile in my shoe theory. So a little bit about sex, sexuality, and gender. This is how I define it. Sex is physical characteristics, whether you're a man or a woman, a male, female. Gender is always presented as cognitive, your intellect, your emotion, your behavior. Sometimes roles get into that discussion. Sexuality is, it's really kind of a difficult one to define, actually. It's your sexual preference, kind of people you're attracted to sexually. And the reason I think it's difficult to define is because I think of sexuality of two different types of attraction. And this was really forefront in my life, trying to relate to men or to relate to women, because I understood I was attracted to women on an emotional level, but I was attracted to men on a physical level. So that was kind of my sexual attraction, was more to men, but I had that strong need for the emotional attachment of women. So sex is generally heterosexual, means men and women. So let me take a quick look at these notes. And of course that's fundamental to any discussion about transgender, the idea that sex, sexuality, and gender are two different things. I think a lot of people really do display an intuitive sense of that when they'll say, oh, most people have some masculine qualities and some feminine qualities. So I don't know why this whole transgender thing is so difficult to accept. But the other thing that I think is always confusing in this discussion is that people associate sex and sexuality as the same thing, and I think they're two different things as well. A woman might be attracted to a man, but she's not attracted to all men. So she's heterosexual, but sexuality is really bounded by a lot of different factors. And so the discussion then is that all of these things are on some kind of continuum. Gender and sexuality are all on some type of spectrum or continuum, and you can have a wide variety of combinations. I don't know if that makes it more clear, or how familiar you are with transgender people. There's a lot of disagreement around what normal sexuality and gender would be without all the social constraints that we have, but that's really kind of another presentation. So transgender then, this is my definitions. Sex is, physical characteristics. Gender is cognitive characteristics. Sexuality is your orientation toward another person in terms of sexual activity. And then transgender, relating to or being a person whose gender identity differs from the sex the person was identified as having at birth. That's a formal definition. In reality, the word transgender is used by so many personalities and writers and activist groups that it virtually has no meaning, and that's kind of the confusion. Even in the transgender community, there's always this ongoing discussion about who are the real trans people. One major classification that some trans people will make is transsexual. So I would fall into that category of transsexual. I've actually transitioned my physical identity to match my female gender identity. but it's still a rather confusing issue. There's really no opposite to transgender, and there's really no opposite to feminism. That kind of gets into my whole concept of feminism being a struggle really among women. I suppose you could have masculinism. I won't get into that. There are groups, of course, that are fighting for men's rights. I spent a lot of years in those groups, and so I have some familiarity with the men's side of the feminist issue. And I will touch on that a little bit. Next slide. Questions? That makes some sense, or everybody totally confused by now, or? Okay, we'll move on. First wave feminism. So mostly I'm presenting this here just to give people some idea and perspective on just how long this struggle has been going on. First wave feminism is generally marked with the Seneca Falls Convention in New York in 1848. The early movement was aligned with the temperance and abolitionist movements and the suffrage movement. That was one thing I found interesting. Suffrage, the temperance movement. Does everybody know what the temperance movement is? That's prohibition. Doing some research on this, I was amazed to realize just how long that temperance movement had been going on before it was enacted in, what, late 20s, early 30s? The national suffrage movement, now that's voting rights, right? Everybody knows that. Actually started pretty vehemently in 1913. It was actually a pretty violent movement. There were, I mean, the women, it was peaceful protesting, but they got a lot of very angry response from mobs of angry men. There were arrests. There were very harsh prison terms. It was a pretty brutal campaign. And the National Women's Party, this is the first women's political party, 1913. I think that's pretty amazing too. The ERA movement started in 1916. Well, no, 1916, first women's political party. The National Women's Party began the Equal Rights Movement, Equal Rights Amendment movement in 1923. And that Equal Rights Amendment was introduced in Congress every year up until it was finally passed in 1970. So it took 50 years to get that through Congress. It still hasn't passed the states. The National Women's Party did a lot of local organizing, passed a lot of local legislation around divorce and custody rights and jury service, property rights, and ability to enter into contracts. Let's go on to the next slide. And this is the Declaration of Sentiments from that Seneca Falls Convention in 1948. Women at that time had virtually no rights whatsoever. They could not own property. They oftentimes were not allowed to keep any income that they had. They would not get custody of their children in a divorce. I'm not going to read through all of these, but you can see this is a pretty scathing indictment of the patriarchy at the time. He has made her, if married in the eye of the law, civilly dead. He has taken from her all right of property, even to wages she earns. He has framed the laws of divorce as to what shall be the proper causes of divorce. Let's see, there was one. I had one other one highlighted here I wanted to point out specifically. Right, this one here. He has made her morally an irresponsible being, as she can commit many crimes with impunity, provided they be done in the presence of her husband. And I'm going to speculate here that we're talking about sex. Let's go on. Any questions? All right, then the warriors. I'm jumping a little bit ahead here. There were a lot of women that served in the military during World War II, the Wax Waves and the Wasps. Probably the most iconic image of that female independence during the warriors was Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter was the star of a government campaign aimed at recruiting female workers for the munitions industry. American women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers during World War II. The aviation industry saw the greatest increase in female workers, about 65%. The munitions industry used this "We Can Do It" poster for recruiting female workers. Despite the contribution of women to the war effort, female workers rarely earned more than 50% of male wages. So a big pay issue at that time as well. The middle image was actually commissioned by Westinghouse. They used it initially to campaign or to boost worker morale. The image really didn't become popular until the women's movement started using it in the 70s. So if anybody recognizes Rosie the Riveter, that's where it comes from. This picture here is thought to be the model for the middle picture for Rosie the Riveter. I don't find a whole lot of evidence to support that, but what I wanted to show you is that she is wearing heels. And women wore heels to work right up on through almost the 80s. Next picture. So this is kind of where second wave feminism started. The National Organization of Women, formed in 1966, and I want to emphasize their vision at the time. And that's the original statement of purpose, that take action to bring women into full participation in the mainstream of American society now, exercising all the privileges and responsibilities thereof in truly equal partnership with men. And the organizers have now recognized that equality demanded economic independence for women, requiring a social restructuring that wouldn't simply create employment opportunity for women, but create economic value for the work women do. Community work and child rearing would have to be shared more equally by husband, wife, and society. And that didn't happen. And that's probably the main thing I'll be talking about. Next slide. Mother's Day. Yeah, like I said earlier, when I was a child, this was my dream. I dreamt of being a 50s style mom, just like Donna Reed or June Cleaver. I don't know if any of you recognize those old shows. That was the perfect family model that I grew up with. The husband was the provider, the woman was the homemaker. And that, you know, after the war, there was a huge investment in the GI Bill that funded public education for men. Housing loans kind of moved America to suburbia, and women were pretty much, well, I'm going to say enticed back into the home. Most women that had to leave their jobs might describe it a little differently. That became that grand experiment became the institutionalization of the American housewife. Women were supposed to enjoy their natural nesting instincts. We've heard that before. And at the same time, men experienced free reign of the entire world outside the home. My parents fit well into this 50s model of caretaker and provider. Go on. Questions? Everybody's following along? And then came the feminine mystique. Actually, the feminine mystique came before the National Organization of Women. In part, was really kind of a driving force for that. And this is from the book as well. It's like my mother, like millions of other American homemakers, began to realize how meaningless and unappreciated the role of housewife actually was. I began internalizing that conflict from my early childhood in Grafton when my mother was bringing home elephant ears following the night shift at the mill. I witnessed her dismay intensify over the years as she grew ever more insistent that the futility of her life was emphasized in her children because they all took after their father and none acknowledged her sacrifice and commitment with any like sacrifice of their own. And we're talking about girls here. My two sisters, they of course followed the economic opportunities of the women's movement from the 60s and the 70s. They got outside the home. So I was born just 2 months after the historic Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but that was the Supreme Court decision that outlawed segregation in school systems. And the point I want to make here, in the book I trace the civil rights movement through from the African American civil rights movement, which really was getting well underway at the time I was born, through the feminist movement, into the gay and lesbian movement of the 70s. And the African American civil rights movement was kind of divided between civil disobedience, that was really kind of the Martin Luther King movement, and the Black Power movement, which was more characterized by people like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael. That's the only point I want to make here about the civil rights movement. Go ahead. And sexism in the 60s, this is nothing new, right? This has been around forever. This is how men have perceived women for centuries. Gloria Steinem, a major leader of the women's movement in the 60s and 70s, actually took a role at the Playboy Bunny for a story she wanted to do. I've read that actually. It's amazing how blatantly sexist this employment was. Even after they had the bunny dip. Bunny dip. That's how you serve drinks without falling out of your costume. She described conditions at the club, but even after that, she complained, Gloria Steinem complained how many letters she got from women asking how they could become Playboy bunnies. So there's a certain level of conditioning that women experience growing up in this culture. To me, it's not unlike the way NFL recruits cheerleaders today, and I wonder sometimes how much things have changed, really. So this is from the book as well. Media portrayed women protesting Miss America and Playboy bunnies, but the feminist movement was being won in the courts. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, again, was largely accomplished through the Black African American civil rights movement. One of the interesting things about that movement is that the black men did not want to include sex in that either. But at that time, black household income was very dependent on women, black women, and so they wanted that protection, and that's really how sex got into the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So we can thank the African American community for that, and again, black women who are often at the front of these movements. I just mentioned one highly visible success at that time was stewardesses, who could no longer be fired because of age or marital status. So stewardesses were the Playboy bunnies of the era at that time. The feminist arsenal expanded to include education with the passage of Title IX in 1972. Title IX is largely accredited with the explosive growth of women's sports. When I was in school in 1972, there were no girls' sports in my school. But of course, sports isn't even mentioned in the bill. Go ahead. So this is what happens when a woman puts on a Playboy bunny costume. Again, I think I already told you this story. Gloria Steinem took that job. She was only on the job for 2 weeks, but it really damaged her career in horrible ways. She was attacked for exploiting her good looks on one side, and on the other side she was really blacklisted from doing more serious work. It wasn't until many decades later that her publication about the conditions of the Playboy Club was recognized as a real feminist work alongside the feminist mystique. There's like 60 years between those photos. The other one is me this year, 2019, at a New Year's party with a Playboy Mansion theme. I don't think people are going to take me seriously today if I dress that way. I'm introducing it here as kind of a foreshadowing or a preview of modern feminism, where regardless of how a woman dresses, it's not a sexual invitation, and it shouldn't be an interpretation of who she is as a person. That's a wonderful ideology. In practice, I don't think it works that well. Go ahead. So, yeah, I mean, this is the response. Reform, social reform is never a straight line. Change is never a straight line. There's always a response, and the response to the Equal Rights Amendment was Phyllis Shapley. When the initial response to the ERA after Congress passed it in 1970 was very strong. It was ratified by 30 states within the first year, and then the Stop ERA movement evolved. It's kind of interesting what the positions that the opposition was taking. Organizers claimed women would lose their right to alimony and child custody, but I think probably the most effective tactic in the Stop ERA movement was the idea that women would lose their exemption from the draft. At that time, the draft was a real serious issue in America. The Vietnam War was going on, and a lot of young men were being drafted. But what's interesting too is the response from the religious conservative communities, the evangelical Christians, Mormons, Orthodox Jews, Roman Catholics. They argued that the amendment would guarantee universal abortion rights, same-sex marriage, and eliminate single-sex bathrooms. Has anybody heard the discussion today around single-sex bathrooms? It still rages on. So, women continued fighting for equity in the courts, fighting for custody, fighting for alimony, and ultimately fighting for their very lives against the threat of domestic violence. In 1970, only 13% of families were headed by a single parent. By 1996, that number had doubled, with 84% of these families headed by women. Dissolving family values fueled a divorce industry that would grow to $50 billion by 2005. So that's all from the book as well. And so this is the point I wanted to make about the divisions in the movement. The African American civil rights movement was split between civil disobedience and black power, but the feminist movement was divided between empowerment and protectionism. And that remains a significant issue to this very day. But almost from the beginning, the women's movement was kind of being overtaken by the gay civil rights movement. I think that's generally marked by the Stonewall riots in 1968. Transgender women were pivotal in that uprising as well, including black transgender women. They're not generally recognized in the history of the gay civil rights movement, sometimes transgender people would prefer to mark the beginning of the LGBT civil rights movement with the Compton's cafeteria riots in 1966 in San Francisco. That was entirely trans women. From my perspective, I probably don't talk about this much in this presentation. It's quite a bit in the administration policy work I did for the Rutledge book, but I think the gay movement was largely a white male middle class movement and more of an economic success than a major social victory. One thing you'll see, I mean, the class hierarchy in the LGBT community isn't unlike the class hierarchy in the heterosexual community. You have wealthy white males at the top and transgender women of color pretty close to the bottom in terms of economics. During this period, white men, of course, didn't really have to divulge their identity. They had better paying jobs. The lesbian women were typically raising children, just like the heterosexual community. They typically had lower paying jobs and lower socioeconomic status. And so that economic stratification exists as well. So the transgender movement, I tend to think that the transgender movement is considerably separate from the LGBT, gay, lesbian civil rights movement. I think issues of gender are considerably more complex, and the trans community is substantially more aligned with feminism. Most of the focus on the transgender community focuses on transgender women. So a lot of the sexism still revolves around the trans issues. Probably the number of trans men is nearly the same as the number of trans women, but the focus, of course, is on women. Next slide. And that brings us to third wave feminism. According to feminist scholar Elizabeth Evans, the confusion surrounding the constituents third wave feminism is in some respects its defining feature. The confusion surrounding what constitutes third wave feminism. I just can't accept this statement, and that's why I put it on there. I think today's feminism really is still third wave feminism, and I'll get into that a little bit more. I don't really talk about third wave feminism in the book. In terms from a historical perspective, maybe from my life experience. Women in the 90s were enjoying the opportunities achieved by the first and second wave. In some respects, it was a period of self-indulgent, indulgent self-expression. And that's maybe where some of the confusion comes around. There was a lot of social media around sexual liberation, right? And the freedom to dress as you please and act as you please and be as sexual and feminine and girlish and all of those things, which really was quite contrary to the traditional roles of equal rights and economic opportunity. And so that's, I guess, maybe where some of the confusion comes in. The third wave feminism really focused a lot on intersectionality, right? So we have a culture that's changing, that's becoming, the demographics of our culture are changing. It's not surprising that feminism is changing with it. You look, one of Girl Ride is a band. Slutwalk is an organization that I did participate in for a while. But during most of that period, during the 80s and 90s, I was raising children. I was working full time. I was part of that supermom era, right? The idea that women could work, that women should work, but that they still had to take care of the kids, still had to take care of the home. And that was the supermom era. And I think that's largely true still today. The rate of women with children under 16 who are living at home has nearly doubled since 1976. 84% of single family parents are women. So And I don't know how well that's working out in the heterosexual community. Fathers are really picking up a great deal of the workload in terms of caring for children and taking care of the home. I haven't really looked into that side of it. One other thing I just added here kind of as an afterthought almost, but in the 50s and 60s, this is the other side of it. Men were really, the unions were really still pretty violently involved in labor relations and working conditions. Women didn't really start entering labor unions in any significant numbers until the late 70s, when labor relations were considerably more civilized and working conditions much improved. So there's a difference of perspectives there as well. Next slide. And then again, this is the backlash, right? Whenever you have progress, you have backlash. Change is never a straight line. Things may seem really bad today, but historically, it's the way it's always been. I had a brief involvement with the gay community in the late 70s. A friend of mine, a coworker of mine, actually had a gay wedding at his home. It was lovely. I cried. That marriage really wouldn't be recognized for another 33 years. But the 80s was a serious setback to the gay civil rights movement. In the late 70s, Anita Bryant is leading the charge to repeal gay civil rights. She had a campaign called Save Our Children. Like a lot of these types of campaigns, they create hysteria about the safety of our children. That's the whole bathroom issue today, that trans women are trying to dress up like women so they can sneak into bathrooms and molest children. I don't know that that's ever happened even once. And then in 1981, doctors make the first AIDS diagnosis. So the 80s was a major AIDS epidemic and disseminated large portions of gay communities. And Reagan was preparing the nation for trickle-down economics. I had to get that in here. It's somewhat irrelevant. Go ahead. Okay, so this is my experience with men. In the early 2000s, I started examining several intersections in my own life. This is when I really started trying to figure out what to do with all these feminine feelings and these transgender issues. Socially, I expressed myself as female gender identity by wearing dresses. This is what I call in the book my man in a dress phase. I spent about 7 or 8 years dressing this way. That woman, that man in the green dress is me. And I had a mustache, and I didn't pretend to be a woman at that time. It worked pretty well for me. I tried to frame it as a men's rights issue, that men could wear dresses. That didn't play out very well. Men don't want to wear dresses. Not most men. But it did fulfill my social needs as a woman. It worked out in really strange ways. One thing that really amazed me during this period was the number of men that actually offered to protect me. I felt that I would get a lot more harassment, I guess, or threats, but it was really quite the opposite. So there definitely are some good men out there, a lot of good men. I ended up attending the Sexual Boundaries group at the Twin Cities. That's that's the Twin Cities Men's Center there. Many of the men were registered sex offenders on parole. I wouldn't have been there without my male passport that I got at birth, and I didn't have the credentials to go to a safer female support group. But there's little funding available to help these men. The funding goes to empower the criminal justice system and to prosecute men. Over time, I spent 7 years in this sexual boundaries group with these men. Over time, I really did develop kind of a respect for their commitment to the group and their ability to maintain emotional stability and dignity in the midst of extreme social persecution for circumstances not inherently of their making. I found that nearly all of the men had grown up in very violent, very incestuous environments. A lot of these men were really acting on things that learned behaviors. They really had no boundaries. They really didn't grow up with any insights to the dysfunctional nature of that behavior. But these escape clauses don't work for men. My relationship to the group was one of victim to perpetrator, right? So I was the rape survivor, I was the woman, they were presumably the perpetrators. But it really became apparent to me why that model is counterproductive. It's really the victim-perpetrator antithesis of the oppositional sexism model where males are superior to females. It really empowers exploitation through gender differentiation and segregation. It's a reactionary model. It's based on treating the victim and punishing the perpetrator. It empowers the criminal justice system, and it profits the therapeutic community. It defies standards of evaluation, early assessment, and intervention focused on prevention. There's really no pretense of restoring functional family dynamics or healing a relationship. I was referred, my spouse was a survivor. The therapy the group that she was receiving support from recommended that I go to the Domestic Abuse Project. And I did go. I went twice, actually. I was surrounded by men that had been ordered to the program for beating their spouse. And that made me really uncomfortable. I didn't want to align myself with that type of an identity. So I never did attend. Next slide. And then family court. I skipped over the book, the chapters in the book here where I talk about, motherhood and raising children and all the challenges that introduced trying to be a mother presenting as a male. Statistically, divorce was almost an absolute certainty for our marriage. We both had prior histories and experience with domestic or sexual violence. I had the gender issues. There's probably narratives I could come up with that might have avoided that, but family court was, I was in family court for 4 years, and it proved to me that feminism clearly has not achieved a full and equal partnership with men. There was overwhelming consensus that no judge would give me custody of my son, and I ended up representing myself. I couldn't really find an attorney that would even represent me in terms of custody of my son. They began that proceeding with an order for protection. They accused me of yelling at my son. That's all they needed to put me out on the street. So where women in the 1800s were unable to get custody of their children, now today the bond between women and children is pretty much a defined virtually right of ownership. And generally it's typically the men that pay the child support. It's a child welfare system that I don't believe has proven to be very adequate. But interestingly enough, the fastest growing family model is single parent families headed by men. So things are continually changing. And I guess we are moving toward greater equality. And the divorce ends with the final decision of the court. I did transition during this divorce, 4 years in family court. I started presenting as a male. I thought that would be the simplest way to come to a quick resolution. That didn't work out. But by the middle of the trial, I was presenting in court as a woman. So that created a good deal of confusion for the court. That was their out. The court believes that the parties became inappropriately focused on the issue of the respondent's transgender identity at the onset of the litigation. This resulted in a significant source of difficulty in reaching finality in the case. But really nothing could be further from the truth. I really started getting into the issue when their attorney started, when I started introducing it as harassment and a violation of my civil rights. So that part of it did get pretty ugly, but it really had nothing to do with the nature of the divorce. I think that, contrary to the desire of Now's founder, feminism really continues to be fuel a battle of the sexes. Okay. So here's back to third wave feminism. That's me during the divorce. The upper left slide is a speech I gave to the Slut Walk in probably around 2013, 2014. This is the Pride Parade, and that's the Slut Walk banner. That's my Pride dress. I wore that dress every year to Pride for about 5 or 6 years. During that time, I spent a lot of time engaging with domestic abuse. Now, as a woman, once I transitioned, that was interesting during the divorce as well. Of course, now as a woman, there were all kinds of services available to me that weren't available to men. So that was an interesting consequence of the transition during a legal case like that. I worked with the Opening the Door, Cornerstone on Opening the Door project. The intent was to try and expand domestic abuse and domestic violence services for transgender women and for partners in same-sex partnerships. And working on that, again, it was becoming increasingly obvious to me that the model of domestic abuse based strictly on gender was wholly inadequate. And this quote at the bottom is from the transgender oral history interview I did for the Treader collection at the University of Minnesota. And I took it out because I think it really does summarize very well what my own personal perspectives are on this issue. And it's the idea that domestic abuse is something men do to women has become so tightly ingrained in our cultural thinking that we can't get past it, and it's not real. I don't disagree with the statistics and the reality that men are typically bigger and stronger and more aggressive, and women do endure most of the injuries. But with emotional abuse, it's a lot more balanced. We've melded those together and made it an issue of violence when often it's not, and it's destroying families. It's driving increased poverty. We need better ways of educating domestic abuse, of evaluating domestic abuse, and that's what the Open Door Project really was about. You can't just pick one because of their gender and assign them as the abuser. It's not realistic. We need better models of domestic abuse. We need better models of assessment. We need better models of treatment. And more importantly, we need better models of prevention. So this is fourth wave feminism. This is, I put this in here because I'm still trying to evaluate what this really means. Fourth wave feminism is generally characterized by the influence of social media. And it's sometimes criticized as feel-good feminism, and I would probably go along with that position. There's a lot of petitions and marches, Women's March, but I don't know that it really has much impact on public policy or even our culture. That's really kind of how I felt. I was at the Women's March in Washington, D.C. right after the Trump election. There were 3 or 4 million people or women that participated in the Women's March around the world. But the women on the stage reflected the intersectionality of third wave feminism. I think the women on the stage I saw a very different presentation on the stage than I felt in the crowd. The women in the crowd to me were presenting a lot of privilege that has been gained by feminism of the 19th and 20th centuries, which primarily benefited the white middle class. And it's kind of punctuated by the sign the woman in the lower left is holding up. So and this is, the both sides of feminism in clear terms. one side is egalitarian feminism. It's the idea that women really need to assume attributes of masculine power in order to compete in a patriarchal system designed around wealth and power. And the other side of it is, the maternal feminism, the idea that we need to value what women do. And that's really a lot of taking care of society, taking care of children, social activism, social organizing, elder care, nursing, all of those things, teaching, maternal feminism. And I think that backlash, that fourth wave feminism type of imaging was clear in the Kavanaugh hearing. We see the Me Too movement is really kind of becoming a characteristic of another man-hate rebellion, right? This is the opposition in a lot of ways. Go ahead. That's the Women's March, 2016. A lot of people there. It was pretty amazing. It definitely was a feel-good experience. I definitely enjoyed being there. Next slide. But this is the women that were on the stage. These are all the speakers from the Women's March. I'm sorry to say I don't know a lot of these women. That's Janet Mock. She's a trans author, wrote a very popular book in 2013-14. She was one of the, that was a very exciting time for me for the transgender movement. We had, oh goodness sake, I'm having a mental block. The trans actor from Orange is the New Black.
That's friendly adultery.
What's that?
Friendly adultery.
Who?
That's the real adultery.
Do you know her? This one? Melanie Campbell?
Leah adultery.
Oh, Robbie.
That's the real adultery.
Which one?
Bottom right. Yep.
That's Melanie Campbell. No, who is it?
Leah adultery.
Okay. I have the name wrong. Sorry. This is Gloria Steinem. This is Scarlett Johansson, and I didn't hear her speak. I don't know what she was speaking about, but she is the wealthiest female actress, the highest paid female actress. Also one of the white women in this crowd. So definitely a very different look than the crowd itself. Oh, okay. And then backing up a little bit, the 2016 presidential campaign that preceded the Women's March, from my perspective, was really probably the most conspicuous aspect of the campaign from a media perspective was the attacking the Trump campaign for sexism and objectification and sexual exploitation of women. That's where the whole pink pussy hat thing came from. There wasn't really a whole lot of publicity around Bernie Sanders' positions, economic positions that were so popular with younger voters. I also spent my teen years in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, very strict ideas about gender. I knew from a really early age that I was going to hell, and I was pretty put off by Madeleine Albright standing up on the stage and telling women that there was a special place in hell for women that didn't vote for the female candidate. And I'll go on to that a little bit more too, because I was a candidate that year myself in the U.S. House race. Second wave feminism focused on expanded opportunities in sports, education, and employment, and the political debate continues to focus on the polarizing issue of abortion. The political narrative really focuses almost exclusively on this single issue, in terms of women's rights. You don't hear a lot about paid family leave and those types of things that would make family planning easier for women. And there's no doubt that Roe v. Wade decision was a very important victory for women. It did for the first time in American history give women full control over the one thing that really has defined them for centuries, and that's childbirth. But it isn't the singular priority, I don't think, for today's younger women. They have much better access to sexual education. They have better access to contraceptives than their counterparts did in the 60s and 70s. Up until 1971, 72, it was illegal for an unmarried woman to have contraception. I was really surprised by that as well. But I think the total gender gap, and this goes back to third wave feminism, really revolves around the intersectionality of today's feminism, issues of race, ethnicity, globalization, intersectionality, and a growing dependence, really, of families on the incomes of women. That should be the issue that unites people in the public policy arena. The inequality of wealth continues to expand at an alarming rate, and it's disproportionately affecting younger generations, and perhaps more equally affecting both genders. And I think as a result, both genders share a more common purpose with respect to the problem of cost of education and job opportunities that are available today. Maybe it makes more sense then for young men who now identify as feminists. And then my conclusion from that campaign, perhaps full and equal partnership with men will start to reach its true potential when the real issues of income inequality are addressed in the public policy arena. This is my House campaign. That's me on the right. That's Andy Craig and Jason Lewis in the middle. That's from the 2nd District. This is the only time all three candidates appeared together. So this would be our egalitarian feminist representative, and this would be our maternal feminist representative. Anybody looking at that picture probably wouldn't even guess that I was a candidate in that debate. But anyone who has seen the debate tells me I did a pretty amazing job. You notice that I'm not even seated with the other two candidates, and that's in part because, not because I'm a woman, not because I'm transgender, not because I'm a maternal feminist, but because I'm third party. But it was very similar to the presidential campaign. The Craig campaign attacked the Lewis campaign for derogatory comments he made about women during his years as a talk show host. But what was really interesting in my mind is that during the Republican nomination process, Jason Lewis made this remark about trans people. He said, allowing transgender students to use the restroom facility or locker room of their choice, that is an abomination that no school district should adopt. I also note that the transgender community doesn't really like the term transgender, but that's a side note. The interesting thing, of course, about the candidate field is that it included a transgender woman, it included a lesbian woman, and it included this male candidate, presumably representing all these traditional patriarchal values. And so there was three candidates that really represented the social dynamics surrounding modern day feminism and that generational divide, but that issue never came up. So, and here's the crisis today. U.S. birth rate has hit an all-time low, fueling fears of demographic time bomb. Anybody know what a demographic time bomb is? That's failure of women to produce enough children to replace the workforce. And it's kind of what's lost in today's feminists. I think the focus on social reform that really kind of characterized the first wave feminism and the idea of equal rights. If you went back and looked at the feminists of the late of the 18th and 19th centuries, you would find that they were very pro-life. So population studies suggest that the best way to reduce population growth is through the education of women, and that certainly appears to be true in the United States. White middle-class women are having fewer children, but probably a more significant factor in today's economy is the actual cost of having children, the opportunity cost of having children, the rising cost of childcare, lost income for maternity leave, the nature of our gig economy and temporary job markets. And so it's becoming more difficult to raise children in that environment. Next slide. But capitalism, of course, depends on constant growth and increasing the labor market. And so we've seen a subsequent rise, enormous rise in immigration. And that's changing the demographic makeup of our society, and that's part of what our society is struggling with today. So if you look at the elections of 2016 and 2018, if you recall the sign that woman was holding up at the Women's March, it was pretty much white women that really put Trump in office. And again, in 2018, during the blue wave, it was pretty much wealthy white suburban women that elected Democrats. So there's a lot of division, again, along racial lines in terms of the feminist movement, right, or women in general. That could also be considered two different sides of feminism. So as women become increasingly invested in adopting patriarchal systems of wealth and power, we continue to devalue feminine work. And feminism remains, in my mind, divided between empowerment and protectionism. And in a lot of ways, the politics of protectionism really becomes a policy of domination. So you don't really hear too many voices proposing an economic model that would properly compensate women for their emotional labors or their social organizing that determines the health of our environment and the health of our nation. And true social benefits, in my mind, come, again, from understanding and rewarding the value of what women do. Who's watching out for the future? Slide. And so this is kind of an interesting representation, I guess, of egalitarian feminism. The concept of feminine values really goes back to the 1800s, this idea of the submissive caretaker role, social responsibility. Women used to do an awful lot of social work for absolutely free. Nursing, teaching, all of that work was extremely low paid or even not paid at all. Putting a woman on a pedestal is an apt metaphor for someone who should be seen and not heard. These are some of the classic slogans attacking the feminist movement. The idea that women talk too much stems from the idea that women shouldn't talk at all. I can remember in the 70s myself when Miss America pageants would talk about world peace. There was a lot of commentary about what a peaceful world it would be if women ruled the world. That's not really happening either. So a vast majority of women are still dominated by the patriarchal power dynamic. Celebrating women who have achieved full representation in that power dynamic undermines the concept of feminine values and gender equity. It certainly contradicts the goal of stated 50 years ago to create economic value for the work done by women. That's community work, and child rearing would have to be shared more equally by husband, wife, and society. So I'm repeating that from the National Organization of Women back in the 60s. And I think the future challenge of feminism probably doesn't really lie in the realm of equal rights or even equal pay anymore, but rather more fundamentally in the realm of restoring social balance. And I think in true feminism, this is my conclusion, in true feminism, a full and equal partnership with men must include all women and not just a privileged few. That's my conclusion. Question? There's some really controversial stuff in there. I can't believe there's no questions or challenges.
It's not a question. Actually, I am so relieved by you talking about feminism the way you do. I at one time in this very place in the panel. No, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Well,
I'm pretty loud. Oh.
Well, they want it for the camera.
Oh, jeez.
That's okay, you can do it.
Well, one time in this very wonderful library, I was on a panel, and and it was about women in labor, really. But I talked about second wave feminists, like myself, losing the battle. And I wasn't very good at defining why, but that is why. We were supposed to all be able to share in women's work and to be valued for whatever work we did, like staying home to raise children, for instance, and we lost in that totally.
Yeah, I think that. Oh, that wasn't on anyway. Sorry about that. I think that was the principal failure of second wave feminism. Is that we didn't engage men, for one thing, and it got focused all on the economics, and we lost sight of our social responsibilities. And I do believe that the majority of women are still very highly invested in those social responsibilities. And I think that's our principal failure, is that we have engaged men in appreciating and understanding the value, those values. So, thank you. In fact, we've terrorized men, and it's getting worse. And that's kind of the nature of the Me Too movement. So the way, the way men are responding to that, right? They're saying, well, we want to go back to the old boys clubs where we don't have any women and we won't have to deal with them anymore. That's the natural response. And those are kind of the social narratives that defeat progress. Anyone else? You're all just dumbfounded. I can't believe she said what she said.
Thank you for coming and sharing your story with us.
What's that? Okay.
I just wanted to thank you for coming and sharing your views and your story with us. So.
Thank you for coming to listen. I appreciate that. We have a pretty good crowd here tonight. I'm glad. It's really cold out there. So, with that, I guess we're finished. If anyone's interested in the book, I think the book is here for sale. So. The presentation is not entirely aligned with the book. The book kind of ends actually with the end of the divorce. So that 4-year period where I transitioned and family court is all pretty good drama, I hope. Thank you again.